Whoever asked that question, yes, that's true. So I would like to start out with our video sites, if I can, and I'm going to call the institutions, and if you will introduce yourself. Is someone trying to ask a question?
How to make this go? Speaker. You can just tell you.
So we're hearing a lot of chatter.
They're not. They're going to be in the school doing teaching, right? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do a roll call. If I call your institution, I would appreciate it if you would tell me who's on the line or who's doing the video. So, Blue Mountain Community College, are any of you on the line?
That's a question for
We're
every
here
class.
at Blue Mountain. I don't think we have a video capture of us, but we can see you.
Okay, so you can see us. I agree. All we've got is a little blue square from you.
Yeah, we're working on it now.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Is there anything I can do about this?
I'm afraid we have people that are in a large crowded room with a phone open and they don't know how to mute the phone.
Okay.
You might ask that question, is somebody on the phone in a large crowded room? Because that's what it sounds like to me.
Okay. So we're still getting a great deal of chatter in the background. So I'm wondering if somebody is on the phone in a large group and it's not muted. So please check your phone and see if you can mute it if you are on the phone. Okay.
See, when we stop talking, then all those the gain comes up.
Right. So Clackamas Community College, I have you as listed. You're here. Okay. Can you introduce who's in the room?
Yes. Do you want to start?
Sue Mock, Chair of the English Department.
Tracy Donnelly, Health Sciences.
Paul Mordock, Acton Grant Program Manager.
Matthew Altman, Associate Dean for the Arts and Sciences Division.
Elizabeth Lundy, VP for Instruction and Student Services.
Renee Harbour, Chair of Horticulture Department.
Sharon Parker, Chair of Business and Computer Science.
Introduce yourself.
Bill Waters, Business Faculty.
That's everybody.
Great. Thank you very much. I will, hi Elizabeth, I will encourage you with two things here. One is to try and have your camera adjusted so it gives us the best opportunity to see the group. Clackamas, I think we could see the group, so that was very helpful. Thank you. And we could hear you. If there are any sound problems, we'll figure those out during the introductions here. But Clackamas, we could hear you just fine. If you can hear me just fine, we're good to go. So, Clatsop Community College, are you on by video? Anybody on the phone from Clatsop? Okay. Columbia Gorge Community College, I think you're on the phone.
That's correct. This is Brian Green, Chief Academic Officer. I'm on the phone, and somebody else as well.
And this is Susan Lewis on the phone.
Great. And we could hear just fine. Hopefully you can hear us just fine. Thank you. And we have several from Lane Community College in the room. So if maybe folks would just introduce themselves around the room from Lane, that would be great. Don, you want to start us out, and then we'll kind of meander?
Don McNair, exiting Executive Dean of Academic Affairs at Lane Community College.
Maurice Hamilton, entering Executive Dean of Academic Affairs at Lane.
And you want to go ahead, Kate?
Kate Sullivan, starting General Ed CLO Assessment Coordinator and former English, well, still English, and former Composition Coordinator.
Okay. Our mic is way down here, so you do have to speak up. You're fine from there. Yeah, but you just have to speak.
Christina Howard, I'm faculty here at Lane and the chair of the assessment team.
Joseph Colton.
Ben Hill, math faculty.
Mary Brow, faculty in institutional research.
Matt Danskin, the DQP web developer.
Great. And we'll get to you when we get to OIT. Thanks.
And Sarah is coming late.
Sarah is coming late. Okay, great. And I've so far managed to not be able to adjust the camera to be able to show you all of them. So sorry about that. Lynn Benton is supposedly on the phone. Anybody from Lynn Benton on the phone?
Hi, Carol. This is Bill Bogley from Oregon State. We have Katie Winder from Lynn Benton here with us in our video portion.
Wonderful. Good. Okay, so Katie and Bill, you're together, and we can hear you just fine, so hopefully you can hear us, and that works. And Mount Hood Community College, is anybody from Mount Hood on the line or on the video?
We're on the video. This is Sherry Mosier, the accreditation director, and we have two people joining our conference today from Mount Hood. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Can everybody hear us?
Yes.
Good.
I'm Celia Carlson from the English department.
And John Hamlin, Director of Enrollment Services.
Hey, John.
Great. Thank you very much. Good to have you on board. Oregon Coast Community College, is somebody on the phone or on a video from Oregon Coast?
Hi, Carol. This is Jane Hodgkins, and we're on the video.
Great. Hi,
Jane.
Jane.
There are a couple other people.
Good.
Hi, I'm Chris Spalding, the Aquarium Science Program Director.
And I'm Angie Colgrove, faculty.
Great. Thank you very much. And we can hear you just fine. Hopefully you can hear us as well.
And it looks like Clatsop joined us.
Ah, okay. Clatsop, is somebody in the room? I don't think so. So we'll keep an eye on that because you're right, the video has now come up for them. Portland Community College, I believe we have you on video. Anybody from Portland out there?
Usha Ramanujam, Chair for Business. I'm on the phone, not on video.
Okay, great.
I heard that Portland Community College was experiencing some
difficulty?
video technical.
Okay, so Portland's having some video problems. Is anybody else on the phone from Portland? So we'll watch for them to come up. Rogue Community College, anybody online or on video from Rogue?
Bill Harone, Rogue Community College, online.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Tillamook Bay?
Hi, this is Tom Anderson, Tillamook Bay Community College business instructor.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and then we can hear you just fine. Umpqua Community College. Nobody from Umpqua yet, okay. Eastern Oregon University, I think we have a few people, so.
Hi, this is Eastern Oregon. Can you see us?
Keep talking. They talk for
See us
5
on the
seconds, they go full screen.
Okay. Okay.
Oh,
We're just
okay, I
wondering, 'cause
see you waving. Yes, we can see you on the screen.
We can't see us, so we didn't know if anyone else could, so we'll introduce ourselves.
We can see you.
Okay, just checking. All right.
It's that nice ovally round wood table that you're around, so yeah.
I'm Heidi Harris. I'm English faculty.
I'm Colleen Duncasio with Student Relations.
Nancy Knowles, English faculty and director of the Oregon Writing Project.
Sarah Witt, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs.
And we have another person who's joining us on the phone, so she might need to introduce herself separately. She's in a separate area.
Sure. This
Okay.
is Evans. I'm English faculty and director of the Writing Center and Writing Across the Curriculum.
Great. Thank you very much. And we've already heard from Bill with Oregon State when we also heard from Katie. So we've got that figured out. Portland State University, is there anybody either on the phone or on video from Portland State?
This is Susan Carlisle, and I am the program coordinator for the Education Leadership and Policy Department at Portland State. And Gary Brown left because he's going to find another phone. We could not have speaker access, so he's gone to get on another line.
Okay.
And this is Rowana Carpenter. I coordinate assessment for the general education program at Portland State.
Great. Good. Thank you very much, and we could all hear that just fine. Southern Oregon. Shane, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here just on the phone.
Great. Thank you. Western Oregon University.
Hi, this is Carol Harding. We're on the phone, but we haven't gotten the IP address to go video, but we're ready to.
Okay, so that had to be set up in advance.
We tried to, but we never got the IP.
No, they have to call into them. They would have to provide.
So we may we'll try and figure it out, but I don't think we want to take the whole group's time. So
okay.
Is there a short thing you can say, Dean?
Do you know what your IP address is?
Yes.
Okay, what I have here is 140.211.112.27.
Oh, it's 140.11.116.114.
140.11.116.114.
140.211.
211. I thought okay. 140.211.116.114.
Correct.
Okay.
Is Meet Me on the line? Can you hear that, and can you add them in? They're not responding. I'll call that in. Can
anyway,
Carol
Harding, I'm humanities, and I'm here with Diane Tarter, who is our interim dean of LAS.
Hi.
Great. Thank you very much. And we can hear you, and we'll see if we can get you connected through video. And Oregon University System, Kent?
Good afternoon. This is Kent Neely from the OUS Chancellor's Office.
Great. Okay. We got quite a bit of feedback from you, Kent. I'm not sure what that's about, but we're really getting some background noise from it.
I was muted.
Yeah, Ken, if you're in a room that has both telephone and video conference, that will always happen. So you have to choose one source over the other.
Okay. And CCWD, is there anybody in the room or on the line for CCWD?
Cam's here.
Hi, Cam.
Hi there, Carol.
Nice to have you here.
I can be with you until about 1:30 when I have a hearing, so.
Okay, great. I don't know if the person from NALOA is also on the phone as well as on the webcast, so, but if you are, we'd love to hear you introduce yourself. If you're not also on the phone, we won't be able to hear you, so, okay, great. And then, Marcus, I can see you on there, and welcome.
Thank you.
Great. We will hear from you in just a moment. So we had a couple of people that look like they have joined in. So is anybody from Clatsop in the room yet? Anybody else from Portland Community College in the room? Has your video situation gotten addressed? Doesn't sound like it. How about Umpqua Community College? Is anybody on the line from Umpqua? Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to introduce themselves, whose name I did not call or whose school I did not call? I'd appreciate it if you'd speak up now so that we know you're with us. Oh, OIT. Yeah, that's right, because you're in the room. Sorry, Sandra.
Sandra Bailey from Oregon Tech, and I'm the Director of Assessment. And I think joining us at 1 o'clock we'll have Hallie Newport and Marilyn Kessler.
Great, great. Thank you. I'm sorry that I...
Gary's here from AAC&U.
Oh, wonderful. Good, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, good. Well, we knew it would take us a while to do this check-in, and I apologize for the time it takes, but I think it makes the rest of the meeting go more smoothly if we have a chance to really check in with every site and make sure we can hear each other and see each other and move forward. So I'm going to turn this over to Ron Baker now. I, by the way, probably should have introduced myself. I'm Carol Schaafsma. I always forget to do that. One of the co-coordinators for this project. Ron Baker is the other one, and Ron's going to introduce Marcus, and we'll get going.
Well, I get the pleasure of introducing the man who needs no introduction, and Marcus Kolb. He's a strategy officer with the Lumina Foundation. I will say that he's been a colleague, a friend, and a supporter of our work in Oregon. And he's graciously agreed to take some time this afternoon to talk about the other projects, the other DQP projects that Lumina is supporting, and to inform our own thinking by sharing the work and the progress that they've made along the way. So Marcus, I'm just going to get out of the way and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ron. You're too kind, and it's good to hear everybody's voice. Let me start. Can everybody hear me? Let me see thumbs up. I'm looking at 11 or 12 panels. Okay, great. Thanks, Ron. My name is Marcus Kolb. For those of you that I have not had a chance to meet, I am a strategy officer at the Lumina Foundation and manage all of the work that's going on right now with the degree qualifications profile. Ron and Carol were kind enough to invite me to talk just briefly about the state of the work, and also allow an opportunity for us to have some conversation if there are outstanding questions or issues that you think the foundation should be thinking about or that you just want to know more about. We can take a few minutes to do that. This is a tough format to sort of hold forth on, so let me just take 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes maybe, to talk about the state of the work, where we are now, and what we're thinking about going forward here, and then we can open it up to whatever sort of conversation you all might want to have that I could be useful in. Let me begin by saying how grateful we are for all of you that are sitting in these rooms right now participating in this conversation. There are 8 grant-funded projects going on right now across the country. We calculate somewhere north of 250 institutions involved in using the degree qualifications profile in some way, and you all are obviously a key component of that work, and in particular, what's unique about the work that you all are doing is the fact that Oregon really represents our first pilot test of this work at a state level. So there are a number of projects that span multiple institutions. I'll talk about all of them briefly in just a moment, but Oregon really represents our first opportunity to see if something like the degree qualifications profile would have use for a state encompassing all of the institutions in a given state. You guys were either foolish enough or brave enough to say, let's give that a shot, and we are very grateful for you all doing that, and I'm also grateful for you all taking time on a Friday to spend some time talking about it. So I did allude a moment ago to 8 grant-funded projects that are out there. Obviously, you all are one of them. There are 4 other projects with regional accreditors, including the Higher Learning Commission, or North Central, as some folks like to call it, including SACS, which is the Southeastern group, including WASC and ACCJC, which encompasses, you know well, California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Territories. There are also 3 other grant-funded projects with ASCU, with the Council of Independent Colleges, and with AAC&U. All of them really sort of have hallmarks and maybe different areas in which we're focusing or trying to learn more. It's important as we go, and I don't say this by way to sort of lessen the stakes, but I say it in full disclosure about what's happening here. Although we're 2.5 years into this work, amazingly enough, the original DQP was released in January of 2011. By and large, we still need to think of this work as pilot in nature. So while there are a lot of institutions out there and a lot of work going on, all of it, even that which is wrapping up, and we will see some of it start to wrap up this year, really is still fairly described as pilot work, because when we began, we didn't really know what we had here, and when we began, we didn't really know what you all might want to do with it, and we're starting to figure that out. So what you see across the projects right now are a couple different things. If we think about the accreditors as a group, the folks that I noted before, what you're seeing really is an exploration of the DQP as some angle on the issue of improving quality at the institution. For example, the Higher Learning Commission WASC has taken the degree qualifications profile and written it into their new handbook as a way that institutions could discreetly examine the issue of quality when they are going through the accreditation process with WASC. So the DQP then becomes a tool by which you can view the curriculum and student learning and have an informed conversation with common language about how students are progressing. For the Higher Learning Commission, they're really looking at it as part of their quality improvement process. So institutions that are already accredited but then having to sort of re-up on their accreditation, one way to frame it, you could use the degree qualifications profile to facilitate some level of self-study. So you might pick a degree program or a college or maybe even a credential to sort of use the DQP to view it through and say, okay, what sorts of learning are we expecting here? Are there areas that we might feel like we want to improve? How are we doing in terms of developing assessments that get at the things we're interested in? And that's sort of how the Higher Learning Commission is thinking about it. The SAC's work really revolves around historically black colleges and universities. The HBCUs there, 22 of them, 2 each in 11 states, are really looking at the DQP as a way to think about curriculum development and improvement. And we were particularly interested, of course, given the Foundation's focus on underrepresented students, and what this might mean for the HBCUs. And SACS was kind enough to orchestrate a project in that regard. And then the last little one that I did not mention, not little in size, but the last piece of this 4-pronged project is the work that ACCJC is doing. And they're really working across community colleges, bringing in some CSUs, and they're helping us experiment with another piece of our student learning outcomes agenda, which is tuning. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but our sense at the Foundation is, and we're hearing this a lot from folks like you, is we have to push tuning and the degree qualifications profile into a more cohesive unit and not allow them to stand alone. So the ACCJC work is really going to help us experiment in that area, and they're just getting started. When we look at the other projects, what I really want to highlight for purposes of this conversation briefly is the work that AAC&U is doing and has done in really having a conversation across the community college and 4-year lines to talk about how we can facilitate better transfer and use the DQP as a common language that would push that transfer conversation along. In some ways, it's a good analog for what I think you all are trying to do in Oregon, and I think I heard Terry chiming in there on the phone. I know they have particular interest in what you're doing, not only from a tactical standpoint, but also because of your status as a LEAP state and how the DQP and LEAP sort of overlap and certainly are mutually supporting. So AAC&U is really doing leadership work in this area of transfer between 2- and 4-year institutions and figuring out how the DQP might play, as well as bringing the policy question to bear, which is, if we think about the DQP and its implications, what sort of policy mechanisms might be in place at the state level that would facilitate the use of the DQP and, in fact, encourage it. So there's a great deal of work going on there, and that's just the funded projects. Now, if we step out into the 100-plus unfunded institutions that we're aware of, and NALOA, who I think Carol called upon, maybe they didn't answer or they couldn't, is out there right now cataloging for us who is using this thing. NALOA is telling us that there's all sorts of work going on out there among these unfunded projects, which include things like reaching out to employers and talking to employers about whether or not what's encompassed in the DQP is in fact what employers are looking for in graduates. That's a key question. We're certainly interested, and we were grateful to see institutions were immediately interested as well. I think that's an area that's worth going towards and learning quite a bit more about. It really speaks to what we need to do next with the DQP. And then there's that question of assessment, and we see some of these unfunded projects getting deeply into the question of, okay, we agree these are relevant outcomes for our students. How are we going to assess them well? What sort of mechanisms do we have or do we need to build that will allow us to do assessment across these individual students, really down at the student level, to figure out whether they're learning what it is that we want them to learn? So I said we're 2.5 years out. And so the question really from where we are, which is what I hope I just described in a few words, is really what we need to do next. So the first piece of that is we're looking at a revision to the current DQP to be released sometime in 2014. And we're in the process right now of collecting feedback, not only at the project level, but at the individual institution level, and the opinions of every individual we can get our hands on about what's working and what's not working with the DQP and how we might adjust it to improve it. Now, when I say revision, sometimes that's frightening for people. I do not want it to be at all alarming. You all are saying to yourselves in your heads, wait a minute, we're in the middle of a project here. Why would you change this up on us? What we're really anticipating is change of 85% will remain fixed, 10-15% will change. Things that we're hearing right now that I'm sure will resonate with some of you in the room that we might see change on, things like that second language requirement that's in the document, which people have found to be an unreasonable expectation for credentials. Another change would be grappling with the issue of ethics and whether or not ethics needs to be more explicitly engaged in the document. That's something that the drafters will take under advisement, and we're going to begin conversation around what that new version might look like here this year, with hope that we will get it written and released. I think the real change that you could expect to see is a much more user-friendly document than what you currently have. So all sorts of attendant examples of assessment, examples of teaching and learning, examples of application at the institutional level that will sort of begin to steer it away from a very academic, sort of cold, distant document about very complicated outcomes, lots of compound language in there, starting to break it out into something a little more easily digestible, and also with examples that will help people who, when they read it, they go, huh? To more sort of quickly plug into, what can I do here? How can this help me do my work? So I expect you'll see that in a revision. Some other things that will be happening in terms of actual work. We will probably begin work on sort of a second related, fully aligned document that right now we're calling the certificate qualifications profile. We recognize that this work is not just about the associate degree, the bachelor's degree, the master's degree, but there are all sorts of credentials that happen at the associate level and below, or with less amount of time, that we need to account for if we're going to really talk about a fully aligned system of credentials without loss of credit for transfer. So we're going to be reaching out to the community colleges that are in the room here and others to get your feedback on what we might do to create a certificate qualifications profile. Probably a separate document. We don't need to make what we have more complicated, but we do need what we create around certificates to speak directly to the outcomes described in the DQP, and we'll convene a group of folks, a separate group of folks from the drafters of the DQP, to start drafting that CQP. I mentioned before we're going to need to blend the work of tuning into this. I think you'll see projects around that. I mentioned the ACC-JC project. There will be more work in that area in 2014. I think we also need to explicitly explore how the DQP might position us to be participants in the sort of growing and accelerating conversation around competency-based education and moving away from time as a good measure of student learning to something else. It certainly is my opinion, and I think those at the foundation would agree, that if we think about the DQP as an articulation of competencies, it really does give us a placeholder or some footing to have a conversation around competence and take this work into that arena. Because I think while we'll have a tuning body of work, we'll have a DQP body of work, eventually we'll have a CQP body of work, it might all roll up to a conversation around competence that encompasses all of these things and others that really move us to a different way of thinking about our credentials. I think one final question I would sort of put on the table that we're really thinking a lot about is this question of ownership, and a sense that as far as these documents go, the DQP, the CQP, whatever else may come around, the foundation is probably really not the right long-term owner of these things. As a matter of fact, we kind of hate to have it referred to as Lumina's DQP at this point. We always have. Our sense has been, and the drafters took the position, that what's in the document really has spawned from the field, and that's why you have those pages and pages of references at the end of the full document. These are not aha moments that foundation folks had or the drafters had. It's really just a capture of all the work that the field's been doing over the last couple of decades. And to that end, it really doesn't belong to the foundation, it belongs to the field. And so then the question is, well, really, where do we put it so it can live for a long time and continue to be useful, where it's no longer necessarily affiliated with Lumina, but can be owned and driven by the field in some meaningful way. So we have to sort of talk that through. Now, what I would say related to moving forward here, and I want to make this absolutely clear, is there's often a concern among folks that are involved in these projects about the short attention span that foundations often demonstrate around their work, right? And I'll be the first to admit, too, there's no question that foundations tend to gravitate towards shiny new things, and things that were shiny a year or two ago or 2 years ago often then begin to sort of suffer in comparison. I can assure you, and all you need to do is go onto our website and read the new strategic plan released in January. The DQP has a pole position in that plan, and in particular in Strategy 8. So I want everybody to be comfortable and confident in the fact that Lumina is going nowhere on this issue, resources are going nowhere on this issue. Our effort to talk about it publicly, to continue to promote it, to support its ongoing development, to foster improvement and change around this work is firmly in place and will be so at least for the next 4 years. So the work that you are doing here, while we want it first and foremost to benefit Oregon and the students of Oregon, we also want it to benefit the conversation nationally, and we're committed to making that happen and to continue to support it for the future. This work in the strategic plan resides in what we call Strategy 8, which is really the development of a seamless system of credentials where learning can happen many places. Students can enter that system, get a credential of some kind, leave the system, come back to the system somewhere later on, pick up their studies in advance, recognizing that learning will happen at the workplace, from other providers, from our traditional institutions, and needs to be fully accounted for in all those areas to create learning that adds to meaningful credentials for students. And this is a key piece of it because we believe the DQP gives us the language that we can convene all providers of learning and talk about what students should know and be able to do with a common language and create and foster and support credentials that answer the needs of students and that are indeed seamless. So I want to close what I have to say here and then open to conversation. Hopefully folks have questions or I hope I haven't said anything scary or dislikable, but we can certainly go down that road. Is just to sort of end on a thought or a point that I've enjoyed making lately and that has really been an aha moment for me. When the foundation got into this work, we really got into it because if you look at our big goal or goal 2025, 60% attainment of high quality degrees and credentials, we used that quality word in there without having really defined it. And what came out of that was saying, well, okay, if we're going to use the word quality, we better know what we mean by quality. And quality are really degrees and credentials that lead to either further education or employment, right? And so then we began to say, well, quality really means student learning, right? Students need to learn certain things to continue on to additional credentials or to be employable. So when we say quality, what we mean is student learning. And I think the advancement in that is quality equals student learning, and I would add another element to that equation. Quality equals student learning equals completion. We often talk about quality and completion as two separate things. And as you think through the work of the DQP and the outcomes implicit in the DQP, and what I mean is things I've already alluded to and I know you all are working on, things like transparency of credentials, greater understanding for students about what they're studying and why, things like improved transfer between institutions so students can take their learning and go from one place to another without losing credits, without losing time, without having to retake courses and have their learning reaffirmed. What we're really talking about is opportunities to improve completion, to increase completion rates, because we know transfer is a barrier. We know that students' lack of understanding about what they're studying and why is a barrier for completion. So I would encourage us to not think about quality as a distinct element of an agenda in improving higher education, but really an element of an agenda around completion, that these two things are interrelated. We cannot pull them apart, nor should we think about them differently. So I hope you think of the work that you're doing not just about improving the quality of teaching and learning and improving outcomes for students, but also, in fact, in improving their opportunity to complete a credential at your institution. So again, I'm really grateful, and the foundation is very grateful for all the work that you are doing and for you inviting me into the conversation today. If it's okay with Ron and Carol, I would stop here and invite folks to ask questions, make comment, and I can certainly spend the next 15, 20 minutes or whatever time your agenda allows to do that. If folks want to reach out to me offline, I'm happy to have that as well. I want you all to make good use of your time today. Thank you for having me. Ron, is it all right if we open it up for questions?
Absolutely.
Is there anything that folks would like to talk about? Wow, I have bored you into submission.
Marcus, let me ask a question for you.
Of course.
You were talking about the short attention span of the foundations and whatnot, and so I have a question, sort of a practical matter, if you will. The project that we have is a 3-year project, which is a long amount of time and a very short amount of time to try and produce significant overarching results. What is the philosophy of the foundation for working with projects, whether it's this project or any of the other projects that you have, to continue the work beyond sort of the exploration phase or the startup phase or the inquiry phase? And then the second part of that question, are there plans for Lumina to encourage additional work in this area by funding grants beyond the number that you've started now?
Yeah, good. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. Second question, absolutely. I think you'll see more grants being made this calendar year by the foundation to support this work. I think some of the areas that I mentioned, actually I probably didn't mention them, I had jotted them down here. I mean, we need lots of work, for example, in the area of assessment and coming up with assessments that are aligned with the outcomes in the DQP. I know you all are grappling in a very real way with the curricular implications of the DQP, and attendant to that is, okay, if these are the things we really want students to learn, how can we assure that they've learned them? How can we assess the learning that's taken place? And we have a lot of work to do in that area. So I say with great deal of confidence that there will be more grants in this year and in the coming years that will allow us to explore areas like assessment, but we'll also bring new people into the conversation, new groups, membership groups, maybe new state systems. I don't quite know, but the second part, absolutely. The first part is a real good question and one we're really grappling with right here and now, because a couple of the grantees that I mentioned, in fact, their grants that we made in 2011 were 2-year grants, and those dollars will end this year. And we're really having to, in a real way, think about, okay, these folks have been good partners, taught us a lot, have desire to continue. How can we support that? I will say, ugly as it sounds, the idea that the foundation obviously can write grants around this work in perpetuity is unlikely, and in fact not a good business model for us. So there will be dollars, but there has to be other ways to support what you guys are doing. Some of the grants, I would say, you might see a second iteration. There might be another grant. Others, I think a couple of things. One, we are acutely aware of the need for a national community around this work. And we have a responsibility, quite frankly, by having engaged you involved in this conversation right now and all the other projects and the unfunded projects for that matter, to support a conversation amongst you all where you can support what you're doing, extend it, expand upon it, improve it, in fact, take it well beyond what we ever thought was possible with it, which in many ways you all have started to do. So I think you'll see, maybe even in the latter half of this year, the announcement of a national meeting, which you all will be welcome to attend, which will begin that conversation, which will build a larger community that we hope will help sustain this work for folks beyond when perhaps their grants are over. I think that's one area in particular. I think another would be sort of springing from that, maybe a subset of groups that sort of reconfigure themselves. So across that national body of work, do we see the community colleges, for example, coalescing around a set of issues that we might be able to support them to work on? So kind of a reconfiguration of the groups right now. Again, our assumptions by working with a state like you guys, by working with accreditors, by working with membership groups, were those were the right units of analysis to enact some real change. We might be wrong. As a matter of fact, there's a good chance we are. Happens quite a bit. So the question becomes, if those aren't the right units to enact change, what are those, and then how can we support them? So I think you will see new bodies of work springing up out of that, and there's a reason. There's a reason that we've engaged places like the accreditors, because our hope is they will see value in what's going on here, and they will say we need to take some ownership of this going forward and support institutions in using it in some way, shape, or form. So I do think there are long-term models that we can look at, Ron, and I think we're just now grappling with our responsibility to sort of figure out what they are.
Okay, thank you. I want to remind you again to mute your video or your phone unless you have a question that you'd like to ask. So do we have any other questions, any follow-up with Marcus? This is your chance.
So we're hearing somebody dial a phone, and it would be helpful if it was muted.
Eric, this is Cheryl in the provost office over in Snell Hall.
Yes.
I talked to Anthony yesterday about the conference call
We're
that
getting-
we're doing with Link.
So we're getting that phone call.
They're calling us here in SNL 216.
Okay.
He said all we need to do is turn the TV on and we shouldn't have a problem,
Yes.
but it says no signal.
No signal? Okay.
Oh,
Did
so
you,
they're-
let's see, is there a remote?
So you're,
Because on
We're
the back of
getting-
the remote, there's some buttons, like if you press
they're
down,
not hearing us.
it won't
They're
detect
not hearing
the
us.
Polycom system.
This is very
Say that
frustrating.
again?
We're sort of held hostage here by a private conversation,
SNL 216.
and we don't know where it's coming from.
No, that's OSU.
Yeah.
That's OSU. So Bill, I don't know if there's anything you can do to help us here. I think that's OSU that's having
It's Oregon Tech.
it's
Oregon Tech.
Oh, it's spelled an OIT. Okay, it's an OIT apparently. I don't know if you can get hold of them to let them know, but they can't hear us, unfortunately. So, Marcus, I do have a question for you. This is Carol Shasta.
Yes, ma'am.
We're hearing pretty frequently from the community colleges that the level of learning represented in the current DQP doesn't represent what an associate's degree really is. And I'm wondering if you're hearing that from any other of the other 2-year schools, and if there's any conversation about how to adjust that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Carol. I probably should have said that as part of our conversation here to begin with. You're right. That is common feedback. It's not feedback we've just heard from Oregon. Couple of side notes about that. One, we've heard a little bit in both directions. I'm assuming your take on it, and if I'm remembering correctly from reading, and I just did a summary today of all the feedback we got from the institutions to help the drafters think through the revision process, a lot of that revolved around the expectations not being high enough, and in fact that the expectations at the community colleges often revolved around simply acquisition of knowledge at the community college level, and that there's much more that goes on there than sort of the assimilation of facts, but that there is obviously a great deal of synthesis and critical analysis of those facts, and that the DQP doesn't adequately respond to that. I think it's great feedback. It is a bullet point that will be put in front of the drafters. I think they themselves have heard this feedback. I know Cliff Edelman has been with you guys, Paul Gaston. He's heard you all talk about it. I have expectations that the revision of the DQP will try and address that in some way. I will say, and this is not an intent to be argumentative, but simply an observation, we have had the opposite observations, that the expectations at the associate level are too intense. This really is not about getting those expectations dead on. What it really speaks to for me is a greater and more nuanced understanding of the fact that students are entering our institutions at a wildly varied level of preparation, and that we have to figure out some way to take students that, let's say at the associate level, we want to get them to a 10, and some are entering our institutions at a 1 and others are entering at a 7. What is a reasonable expectation? Can we really say that one institution's got to move them 9 points and the other only has to move them 3? Is that feasible? Very complex questions, good questions. I think you'll see some language in the new document that speaks to that. I think you might even see some reconfiguration of the way that the outcomes at the degree levels are laid out that makes it easier for folks to think about that more nuanced approach. This really, in a lot of ways, bears on a critique of Bloom being kind of a fundamental tenet of the document. Obviously, if you read it and you know your pedagogy at all, you see Bloom coming through there loud and clear, and Bloom may not be an adequate way to describe what we're talking about here in terms of learning. So I apologize, Carol. That's a winded answer to say yes. We are well aware of that, and I think you will see some changes to the new document that we hope will better account for that.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate it, Marcus, and I think it's helpful for people to hear your thoughts on that. I also think that it's an issue for 4-year institutions as well, because we can ask the question, what's expected of students after 2 years of a 4-year degree? And even though it's not a credential that's being awarded at that point, and maybe the combination of what they've taken so far is a little bit different, there's still a general understanding that after 2 years, after that number of that amount of exposure to different areas, what is it we're expecting of students? So I think they can be part of this conversation as well.
Well, it's incredibly nuanced, right? I mean, when you think about it, most students don't finish the 60 credits and then transfer, right? They take 12 credits and transfer, or 36 credits and transfer. And so there's actually where the document really describes a pretty bright line and really only envisions transfer happening at that 60 credit level. We know that it happens all along that continuum. And you know, the challenge for you all, you know, right there dealing with the day-to-day and how you sort of account for that. So, I mean, there's been some argument made that what we really need is more of a first year, second year, third year, fourth year articulation of learning rather than an AA, BA articulation of learning. I'm not sure that the revision will go that far, but I could see that as a natural outcome. And I know certainly some of the models that we see abroad where we seem to draw inspiration periodically are thinking about it more in that way. So your point is very well taken. And obviously the 4 years are interested because, look, if the AA levels are wrong, there is no way that the BA levels are correct, right? They ratchet. One builds on the other. So if we have to retune, so to speak, the AA levels, then we're going to have to rethink what the BA levels look like to a certain extent.
Chime in as we close this out, and I think this last exchange demonstrates and provides evidence that at least part of the work of the DQP is being fulfilled, and that it's engaging the academic community in conversations about what do we expect of our students, and having that conversation is going to certainly facilitate the transition as students seek higher levels of learning. And so just having that piece of it in place is a very good sign and a very good start. Marcus, we've taken advantage of your generosity of time. We want to thank you again for being so clear and articulate and for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us. And we look forward to continuing to work with you over the duration of this program. Thank you very much, Marcus.
Thank you all very much. Yes, thank you. Have a good weekend, all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Carol, next part is yours.
Okay, so when we set this up for today, we were really thinking that we would have several different topics during the course of the day, and that probably some of you would come and go a little bit during this time period also. And so just a couple of logistics things. One, if you do leave and want to come back, I encourage you to keep your video connection during the time that you're gone, because to disconnect and reconnect will be difficult. So it would be helpful if you just end up leaving the room, leave the room empty, and come back in when you're ready to come back in. And then the second thing is that we do think we will probably run a little bit ahead of schedule. So although our our agenda talks about, say, this next session being an hour long, I do think it will be shorter than that, and it's likely that we're into that last session of what of our next steps for next year before the time on the agenda. So just be aware to check in periodically. There is a webcast of this occurring, and you can connect to that. And if I think about it, I've got the address somewhere. So you can connect to see what's happening and come back to us early if you can. So before we go further, I do want to encourage you also to participate. So I'd like us to just kind of check our mute buttons and make sure they will indeed unmute, because we may have spent so much time asking you to mute things that now you're afraid to unmute it. So I want to just check in. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts either about what Marcus talked about or anything else at this point. And I want to encourage you to at least unmute and say hi, even if you don't have a question.
Hi, Carol.
Hi there. Thank you for that.
Hello.
Hello.
College. I'm gonna disconnect since there does seem to be feedback.
Yeah, there is some feedback, and that's probably because you may have a phone connection and a video connection both at once, and so you're actually getting two audios at the same time. I don't know. Any other questions, comments? Just encourage you to. Okay. I do have some questions as part of this next presentation, so I'm hoping that you will help out with the conversation of the whole group by responding to them. You know, one of the purposes of us doing these gatherings is for you to really be able to learn from each other, and to hear some of the questions you all have, some of the things you might be struggling with, some of the pieces of this that are challenging to you or that are working really well. So I encourage you to speak up as part of that during this next part. We're going to be talking a little bit about program review, and Marcus touched on a couple of things that I think are areas they're looking to learn from that also can be really helpful to Oregon. And one of the things he commented on was that they are hoping to get some sense from employers as to whether the DQP represents a level of learning that is useful to them for employees to bring to them after their education. And I think about that as something that we're often trying to do in program review processes as well. We're looking at our programs, trying to figure out, do these programs actually meet the needs of employers, whether that's at the associate's level, at a certificate level, or at the bachelor's level? Are our students who are completing going out into the workplace and bringing with them the set of skills that employers need? It's really a very similar question. Does the DQP represent that? Do our program learning outcomes represent that? And then the other thing he mentioned was that really a big part of the DQP is to facilitate transfer, to really be able to articulate what is going on at that associate's level and how it is leading to the bachelor's level and the success at that next level. So that sort of ratcheting up, as Lumina refers to it, that place of student learning outcomes at an associate level that are then stated again in a deeper, larger meaning at a bachelor's level, how we help students move through that, and the DQP can be useful to that. I also think that's part of our program review usually. We are looking at, if you're a four-year institution, are we doing what's needed for students who are transferring in? Are we finding the right place for those students to get started, the right background? Are they bringing what they need in order to proceed in a bachelor's degree? And at the associate's level, we're asking as part of our program review process, where are we preparing students for the next level? Are they succeeding at the next level as we are anticipating? So in some ways, I think from what Marcus was talking about, you can really see how DQP could be useful in a program review conversation. And one of the things Ron and I noticed when people turned in work plans last fall, you may remember those work plans where you turned in what you were going to do during the first year. And one of the things we noticed was that several institutions were interested in approaching this conversation as part of their program review process, taking the DQP and adding it into the program review conversation in some way. What we also noticed in the progress reports that you may remember turning in March and early April, we noticed that not a lot of progress had been made in that area. Some of you have started that conversation, but there were several that plans just didn't go as set out in the fall. And most of you commented that it just ended up not having enough time and you're planning to get it done next year. So we thought it might be useful to talk about program review as part of this conference today. So I'm going to lead us through just a little bit of information and have us talk a little bit about how program review and the DQP can be used to the advantage of both. For this presentation, I am using a document that was posted on our website, and it's the one that's the DQP SLOs, a Word document probably. Did it get changed to a PDF? Okay, it's PDF. And you can reach the conference materials by going to www.oregondqp.org, clicking on conferences, which is a heading on the web page, and then finding the May 17th conference and the information for that conference. You'll actually see all the documents you need for today on that website. So if you haven't already gone to that link, you will want to do that. And it's the DQP SLOs that we're using for this one. We're getting a little bit of background chatter because somebody must not be muted. So sorry, but we're going to ask you to check your mute again and make sure it's muted because we are getting a little bit of background from somewhere. Thanks. I think that looking at program outcomes as part of your DQP, as part of your program review is a pretty common thing. So it will help if, so we're still getting just a little bit of chatter back there. I wish I could figure out where it was coming from, but somebody's got something not muted. And now it's quiet. So whoever was talking before and is now quiet, we're okay. So it will help during this next session if you not only have that document in front of you that I just referred to, but also if you're thinking about your own program outcomes. So if you have a program that you're connected with, or if you can go to a website and pull up your own program outcomes, that might be useful in this next part as well. I think it's common when we're doing program review to look through the lens of what a student needs to be able to do later that we're going to try and give them now in this degree. And so often we're looking at what are students' next steps, where they're going to be employed, where are they going to transfer, and we're saying that's the outcome we need to try and reach. Whatever they need in order to do that, that's what we're going to identify as our outcomes. And often it's a group of faculty, sometimes with students, sometimes with employers and other outside advisory committees and that kind of thing, who are coming up with outcomes. And those are all not only common practices, but I think good, strong practices as ways to come up with learning outcomes for a specific degree or major or program. I think what the DQP provides for us in terms of adding it into program review, it provides an opportunity to look at your program from the standpoint of a balanced approach of what a student needs regardless of what their major is. Because that's really what the DQP is about. It is very generic. It doesn't tell you what students should study. It tells you whatever they are studying, these are the outcomes that this group of writers is proposing are appropriate at an associate's level and a bachelor's level. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to agree with it at all. but it helps us look at our own program outcomes differently. And I think that's where its value is that it helps us look at it differently. It allows you to compare your program outcomes to a set of generic outcomes that are in those 5 learning areas. And you've got that in the document. What your document has from the website are the 5 learning areas and the specific outcomes at both the associate and the bachelor's level. So it really zeroes in on those things that are needed according to the degree qualifications profile. So it's an opportunity to really look through a different lens, maybe create and look at it in a little bit more balanced approach, because the DQP is generic, so you are sort of stepping back from your own discipline requirements and looking at it in a little bit larger picture and saying, do our program outcomes for this particular major, are they balanced enough and not just focused solely on a narrow next step, but on a broader, what does a human being need when moving on into society? So it really offers a more balanced look. Again, it's not like you have to adopt it, but it just helps you look at your own program outcomes differently, and can you do you see anything missing or different as part of the program outcomes? And I also think that by comparing program outcomes that you've developed, maybe, if you're a new faculty member, it may have been previous faculty who developed it, but taking a look at those outcomes in comparison to something developed across the country can give you a deeper understanding of the meaning of your own outcomes and a more shared understanding of the meaning of your own outcomes. And I think that's especially true if you've had some personnel changes, that a new person coming in reads program outcomes and develops kind of their own understanding of that and engages in conversation with other faculty in the department about what those mean, but having a conversation that is comparing them to something else will really deepen that understanding and that meaning and give you a more shared common understanding of those outcomes. I want to give you just an example of a couple of outcomes, and this is a part where I want you to actually participate. So I'm going to encourage you to talk with us about what you're seeing. I'd like you to take one section of the DQP. So just take the document, turn to one section, applied learning, intellectual skills, broad integrative knowledge, whichever one you want to take. Just flip open to one page of it. And as I'm reading you this outcome, I want you to look at the outcomes in front of you and see where you see connections, if any. Because what often occurs, I think, when we're talking about our own program outcomes and we're looking at the DQP, we don't see them verbatim in the DQP. And they have not been written, our own program outcomes have not been written within the specific 5 categories of the DQP. So they cross over the categories. And part of what you're looking at is, do you see them? Do you see an alignment? Even though the words are different, even though the information isn't exactly the same, can you see a connection between how they're written in the DQP, a very generic version, and your own program learning outcomes? So here's the program learning outcome I want you to do that with. I'm going to read it to you a couple of times. This is from a civil engineering degree. Students will have the ability to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information, solve engineering problems, and perform modern civil engineering design. So I'll read it to you again, and I want you to look in the one area you're examining, whichever of the 5 knowledge areas you chose. And as I read this, see if those outcomes, any of those outcomes, seem aligned to you. I'll read it again. Students will have the ability to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information. So analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information, solve engineering problems, and perform modern civil engineering design. So look at the DQP outcomes, see if there is a place where you see some connection. So I'd be interested from any of the OUS schools if in the area you're looking at you see a connection. This is where you press unmute and speak up. So from any of the OUS schools, do you see a connection between the statement I just read and the knowledge area of the DQP that you are looking at? You can press unmute and just tell us what institution you're from, and I'll acknowledge you, and then go ahead and give us your connection.
Carol, this is Bill Bogley at Oregon State.
Hi, Bill. Go ahead.
Hi, Carol. Yeah, I'm looking at the quantitative fluency element under intellectual skills.
Yes.
And about the only reaction I have to the question you're posing is that there are some fairly direct connections between the outcome as you described it for, was it civil engineering?
Yes.
And the proficiencies that are described at the bachelor's level. Translate verbal problems into mathematical algorithms and constructs mathematical arguments. Constructs as appropriate, accurate and relevant calculations, estimates, risk analyses, and quantitative evaluations of public information. So these are sort of higher order abilities that a student is supposed to attain, and I think it links fairly directly with some of the types of things that are captured in the outcome you described.
Great.
I would say that there is less to be found in terms of linkage between the outcome you described and what's in the associate level, which is more about procedural fluency and not tackling the more comprehensive or synthetic ranges of cognitive behavior.
Yeah, good. So that's a good example of a situation where the language is really quite different, but you can see the connection of the level of learning that each is talking about. And if you move the generic example you gave from the DQP into more specific to the discipline, that you would end up with something like the civil engineering outcome as well. So thanks, Bill, and thanks for jumping in. I appreciate that. Other OUS schools who would want to make a comment on this? Maybe you were looking at something other than the intellectual skills area. I can wait quite a long time. Anybody willing to press unmute?
Hi, this is Heidi at Eastern Oregon University.
Hi, Heidi. Thank you.
I think the performing modern civil engineering design is clearly the applied learning outcome. presents at the bachelor's level, presenting a discrete project, formulating a question, and then addressing it for an academic discipline. So I think that covers the applied learning outcome as well.
Yeah.
Maybe the language
yeah.
isn't word for word, but definitely embedded in that concept of performance and the applied learning.
Right, right. Good, good. So again, where you have to make some sort of judgments about the words meaning the same thing, but it seems like a good tie for that. Good, good. So I just use this as an example of the kind of discussion that can be started as a result of making these comparisons. And, you know, probably if we were more knowledgeable about civil engineering as an entire group, we'd have even more comments about this and more ways of getting connected. I also think it starts conversations about how you understand the program outcome itself, and that those can be good, rich conversation amongst faculty and students, for that matter, as well as advisory committees and groups like that. I have another example that I want to use that comes from an associate degree. So here's the outcome, and again, look at the document, choose an area, and see what connections you see. And I will read this twice. Adapt learning environments and activities to meet the needs of individual children. This is an early childhood education associate's degree outcome. I'll state it again. Students will be able to adapt learning environments and activities to meet the needs of individual children. So as you think about and look at that learning outcome in comparison to the section of the DQP that you're looking at, I wonder, and I'm going to ask community colleges to speak to this one, what connections do you see between this outcome for the early childhood education associate's degree, adapt learning environments and activities to meet the needs of individual children, with the section of the DQP that you're looking at? And yes, we have somebody here in the room from Lane who's willing to give us a sense of that. So
I think of engaging diverse perspectives, because they call out individual children and adapting different environments. And to me, the associate level outcome is a lower level than what is being asked of this particular student. So at the bachelor's level, the student is asked to construct alternatives in the form of a project or some sort of report, which I think is more consistent with what the associate's degree outcome is, where the student's supposed to adapt a learning environment to meet the needs of children, assuming that's assessed in whether or not, you know, in the instructional environment itself, I would gather. So that seems more aligned with what's currently written as a bachelor level outcome in engaging diverse perspectives.
Okay, okay, good. So other people out there from community colleges, and looking at the areas that you're, the area of the DQP that you're looking at, do you see connections between that outcome and the area you're looking at?
Hi, we're here at Mount Hood, and Dr. Celia Carlson, faculty member, is going to address some of that from the associate level.
Hi.
Great.
We're looking at the student learning outcomes for intellectual skills, the analytic inquiry section that identifies, categorizes, and distinguishes among elements. So you're talking about adapting strategies for children, and so at the associate level, it's the identifying, categorizing, and distinguishing that we were noticing.
Great. Great. Again, sort of, you have to find the common language, the common principles, and it's not necessarily common language.
And it specifically refers to both theory and practice, finding practical approaches to these problems, so that would apply directly.
Yes, yes. Good. I'm wondering if there's anybody on the phone who would like to speak to this one. Adapt
Please
learning
enter your
environments
conference
and
ID.
activities.
Press the pound key when complete.
I'm not sure what that was.
That was a phone.
Oh, so is there anybody on the phone who would like to speak to this? It would actually help if one of you on the phone would speak up. I wonder if we've lost our phone people. I know, I can't tell that. Is there anybody out there on the phone?
This is Donna. I'm going in between class and here, so I'm sorry I can't help. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Donna. I appreciate just hearing from you because then we know the phone is working. So thank you very much. Anybody else? So again, I just wanted to give you...
Usha Ramanujam from Portland Community College.
Yes?
I think what you described, it also seems to fit under specialized knowledge, for children and enabling that knowledge to be allowed to work in that field. So specialized knowledge seems to be a part of it.
Yes, great. I think that that's very true, that is an outcome that is very, that is focused on the knowledge, the specialized knowledge needed for that degree. So good. Good. Thank you for that. So I hope this has given you a little sense of the kind of comparison that might go on in a program review process, and has also given you an opportunity to think about how and where you might fit this in to program review conversations at your institution. When I think about my experience from Lynn Benton and where I might have used the DQP as part of a program review process, I think about places where I see the faculty unsure or wanting, maybe already wanting to adjust their program outcomes. And they're starting to see that maybe they're not quite right, or they need to be restated in some ways. And they're trying to get information about how to change them and what would be effective change for students. And using the DQP as a comparison in those situations might be useful. Another situation I think of is when you do have new faculty in a program, because it's difficult for new faculty who come into a situation, a program that already has outcomes developed, and what do they really mean, and how do they really fit into the degree, and where do they fit with different courses. That kind of conversation takes a deep understanding of what the meaning of the outcomes are. And I think that a discussion by comparing them and looking at the DQP, that can be part of that sharing what those outcomes really mean and what those words really mean.
Carol?
Yeah.
Can I bring up a topic that maybe complicates this conversation? I know that's a new idea that I would do that. One of the difficulties with general education is that we don't have programs per se. And so here at LCC we have CLOs, core learning outcomes, but they're a level of generality that doesn't fit into specific programs. We're not allowed to have majors in general education. So for instance, we don't really have an English major or an English program. And so to a certain extent, the mapping activity where we measure the DQP against programs only works in programs where they have structured, scaffolded coursework that leads to a certificate, for example. And in general education, that is just much more complicated. And I'm wondering if there's a conversation going on nationally about the challenges that are presented by the organization of general education programs at the community college level.
I do think there are conversations that go on nationally about that. Absolutely, because it is I think it is a common struggle. Students who are working both on general education and a major have that opportunity to transfer what they're learning in general education into their major courses, and it deepens and broadens both that learning. And for students who don't have the opportunity to declare that major and have that focus as well, then how do we still move them to that both depth and breadth of learning? And so I think it's more from that perspective. It would be interesting to know what Marcus would say, whether he's heard from other DQP groups about that in particular. And Sarah, you're kind of shaking your head a little bit, so I wonder if you've heard it at AAC&U at all. I do think, however, there are certainly outcomes within the DQP, and partly because it is stated generically that you can make connections to many of the outcomes in the DQP without being specific to a program.
Yes, obviously we can do that, but then that becomes a mapping exercise instead of thinking about student learning as they progress through a curriculum. So for instance, in the coursework that I teach, we have 100 and 200 level courses, but because we don't have a major necessarily, students they pick whatever course they want to meet a humanities or arts and letters outcome. And they might choose one 100 level course that's an introduction to fiction, and then they might choose Shakespeare. And there's nothing that scaffolds that learning from course to course,
right? Because
they're not in a major and they're not being directed through coursework. And that happens in social sciences too.
Sure. Sarah?
I would just add that the construct of a major makes that more explicit because you know there's an end point at a particular discipline. I think there's nothing inherent to general education to prevent that scaffolding. There's nothing inherent in course structures to prevent that scaffolding. And I think the DQP helps us think about what would that look like and what would it take to be more intentional about the progression of students through the curriculum, both at the 2-year feeding into a 3-year level without making students make early on decisions about majors. So I think the major gives you a benefit. If you do know, yes, I want to be an English major, you can start that.
Yeah.
But I think Kate's right. There are definitely challenges, but I don't think it's impossible. I think in many ways it's a conversation whose time is come.
If I could jump in here too, I think what it points out is it points out the historical nature of how Gen Ed was perceived, which was basically a grab bag that you reach in and you get a few courses from a few different areas, and that in and of itself provides you with breadth. Whereas what we're doing now is we're saying, well, it's not just having some breadth, but it is some sophistication within that, some integration within that. And so I think that's drawing the focus back onto how we're constructing the curriculum to actually achieve that. So it is the scaffolding, it is the structuring, so that we do develop a certain amount of depth, still within the concept of what general education is. And there's no doubt it's complicated, and I think it's complicated to some degree because of our past and how it's been historically treated. And the changes that would have to take place there are more fundamental and closer to the bone, if you will, than in a particular program, because you know exactly the parameters are very narrowly defined, and you can see the structuring. But how do you go from a sampling of survey courses, of introductory courses, and if that's all we mean by general education, well, then that's enough. But I think what we're hearing is that's not just what we mean by general education. It's actually more than that. So we have to get our heads around, well, what do we really mean by that, and how can we structure it, not only in the courses we provide, but the expectations for students in order to be able to graduate, that you can't get by just taking a bunch of introductory courses and that meets the qualification. So it's putting the emphasis back to where this all started, which is the educated person. and it starts in June.
And I would say one more thing is that the revision to the AOT that we undertook 5 years ago works against scaffolding.
Yes, it
because
does.
it did away with asking for sequences or even courses that had the same prefixes. And so I don't know if we're going to be able to have a conversation at the state level, but the way that we revise the AOT in some ways works exactly against what the DQP is asking us to do.
And it's finding that balance between what works for the swirling transfer student and what works for a foundation of learning that's truly useful.
And well, they may be in opposition to
Exactly. So it's finding balance between those things. I'd like to give others an opportunity to jump into this conversation. I'm hoping you were able to hear everyone.
This is Shane at SOU. I was definitely able to hear, and it's something that I'm struggling with as well. It's not just general education. Even within majors, people can choose different classes that have different outcomes associated with them, and they progress along their own personalized spider web, so to speak. I'm still trying to figure out how to make a generic sort of major wrap, and then have that flexibility with the general education that the students take, with the classes that the different classes that students can take within each major, with minors, with certificates. I'm still struggling with that whole piece.
Yeah, there are lots of choices that are made along the way, and I think it's a matter of figuring out. Again, it's partly that balance of what works for the student and what works for the progression of learning, and they are sometimes against each other. Other comments about this? Well, I think I heard a...
Carol, this is Tom Atchison at Tillamook Bay Community College. I wanted to make sure the previous conversations were over. I'm still assuming we're still on the piece about program review. We have used it a little bit and looking further at it and directly within our criminal justice. But back to an earlier, as you started this discussion, one of the biggest challenges that we're still having, I have actually tried to take the DQP model in a sense to an advisory group as well as a few employers. From an outsider perspective, and I'm glad to hear the DQP is going to simplify and clean up the language, but particularly from a non-educational perspective, there's a lot of, it took a long time to go through just what some of those terminologies mean. So as we look at it from a program review side, for anybody that's doing it, I would encourage spend some time kind of breaking that up. And if we are literally looking at, because part of our program review does involve getting employers and advisory groups in it, simplifying that will be a big help and a big step.
Yeah. Thanks for that a lot, Tom, because I think that's a good thought and a piece of advice for people who might be looking at doing this with employers. I think frequently we end up needing to translate between the educational language and the language that employers use, and that certainly is necessary as part of this, because it is very, as Marcus referred to, very based on Bloom's at this point, and people just may not think of it in that structure. And I think it can help to define the 5 knowledge areas in language that that employers use and to enter the conversation that way. But you do have to do a lot of translating, you're right.
But I would add, and I would hope, Lumina and Marcus but Marcus was the one who identified how do we define quality, student learning, leading to further credentials and employment, ultimately leading to completion and employment. I'm partly wondering, and I'm not saying we change everything right now, and maybe I'll look to be involved in further discussions on the language. It seems like, though, the paradigm we're looking at it through is educational, and particularly taking it outside, that's just not, at least in the folks that I've encountered down here. Maybe we need to flip the paradigm of it and put it in real world work experience, particularly in the fields of career technical.
Yeah.
Again, that's maybe a bigger conversation, but I just want to reemphasize the paradigm or the lens that we're looking through it is much different than the world thinks of what skills that those students really need to have.
Yes. I do think that there are pieces of the DQP that don't work as well with career technical, or are there's more opportunity there. It doesn't take advantage of what it could take advantage of with career technical programs.
Carol, from
Yes.
Mount Hood Community College, we wanted to pick up a thread of a conversation that had started at Lane and talking about sequencing, and I thought before we leave this topic we could go back and just make a couple comments, because it was just what we were talking about when Lane started talking about the sequencing and the foundation. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carlson here to talk a little bit about her thoughts on that sequencing, because they're looking at that in the Humanities and Writing Department right now. So I thought it was relevant to the conversation.
Hi.
Great. Okay. Hi.
Hi. I wanted to pick up something that Kate Sullivan at Lane Community College was talking about a little earlier, which is that something that we're noticing here is precisely how what we were practicing with these levels of the outcomes, the student learning outcomes, where we were translating the outcomes across different programs, that Kate's talking about this idea of scaffolding, which is really what I see happening here, where we're trying to scaffold these outcomes from the different levels, from the AA level to the BA level and on, and I think that was something that the Lumina people were talking about. So if we're going to try to do this scaffolding, and if it's being worked into the Oregon program structurally, then something that we should probably be thinking about is precisely this idea of sequences, of having students take sequences of writing sequences and math sequences and language sequences, which is where the scaffolding would be taking place and would give students over time, whether it was a 2-quarter or a full year program, that the sequences would be a really ideal way to reinforce those structures and to give students practice with a certain longevity that it seems would be necessary and effective.
So thank you. Yes, I do. I think you're, and this is actually reminding me, and I will give just a little warning to Bill and Katie that you might want to start listening if you haven't been, because I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. But the ratcheting up that Lumina talks about, and that you see in the writing of the DQP, of taking that associate's level, those outcomes, and you can, trace almost from outcome by outcome how it's ratcheted up in the bachelor's degree. And that is the conversation that will occur when we're looking at vertical integration. That's one of the 3 pieces we're going to talk about towards the end of the day today. And that OSU and LVCC have looked at the potential of having that conversation related to the back core, or to pieces of the back core, which is what Oregon State calls the general education. And Lynn Benton has an AS degree that has that exact same core as part of their general education for the Associate of Science degree at Lynn Benton. And they are talking about looking at that sort of ratcheting up. And so, Bill and Katie, I would wonder if sequencing has come up as part of that discussion at all, and maybe you haven't gotten that far, I realize, to really look at that yet. So I don't know whether you would have a comment at this point.
Carol, let me put on, Carrie Concannon, who is co-chair of our back core committee over here, can talk about some efforts to ensure that students take these things in the right order.
Right.
One thing that we've implemented as part of our baccalaureate core are first and second year skills requirements. So our Writing 1, our Writing 121 class, our speech requirement, and our mathematics requirement, we're asking students to have those done by the time they finish 45 quarter credits. And then the Writing 2 requirement, we're asking students to have that complete by the time they finish 90 credits. The third component of our baccalaureate core that really involves writing is a section called synthesis, and these are our 2 upper division baccalaureate core requirements. And for most of our students, they're taking those junior and senior year, and so ideally they will have completed the first year skills and the second year skills by the time they try to tackle that higher order writing that they're going to face in the synthesis classes. And then students also have a writing intensive course that is part of the baccalaureate core, but it's part of their major as well. And they're typically doing that as a capstone somewhere in their junior and senior year. So implementing the first and the second year skills requirement, which we did just in the last 2 years, I think starts to put some order to that skills development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
It was if I could elaborate a little. It was part of the reality of our implementation that despite the fact that the program was organized in this nicely progressive way, is that students were sort of taking these things in orders that didn't really fit the progressive nature of the program. So this became an implementation issue for us.
So I think that's a good example of how sequencing isn't just about what goes on in our own institution, but what goes on in students across the whole 4 years. Yeah.
Carol, do we have anyone from PCC that could maybe speak to what's happened since they implemented their prerequisite where students aren't allowed to enroll in Gen Ed until they finished Writing 115 and Reading 115?
So I know there's somebody on the phone from PCC. I'm not sure if you heard the question about whether you could speak to what has occurred since PCC started doing their prerequisite requirements around having writing before doing other general education courses. Are you still on the phone?
Were you talking
so
to
we're
Mount
not. I was talking to PCC, although Mount Hood, if you've done that also, you could speak to it. Is anybody from PCC still on the phone? So we're not hearing a response. So Mount Hood, have you done that also? Have you moved to a prerequisite for writing before going on into other general education?
We at Mount Hood just had a committee on prerequisites. We have but it's not just for writing as well. We have been discussing moving to a one-tier prerequisite system from a dual-tier proficiency prerequisite system. So we're in the middle of a conversation that's sort of hot and heavy right now, but the recommendation was that we move to a straight prerequisite system, and so I mean watch this space. But that has certainly been a conversation that is very, very fresh for us right now.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. It seems
Carol?
like this could, yes.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? This is Kendra from PCC.
Yes, Kendra, I can. We've got a little bit of back noise, so you might have both a phone line and an audio line from your video on, but we can hear you.
Well, then I won't say much. I think it depends what metric you're looking at, whether it's been successful or not. Part of the problem is that we've been looking at, subsequent enrollment and retention, but that's also changed because there's other variables in place.
Right.
Some financial work with students, and then we have the vagaries of enrollment, so it's hard to tell. Anecdotally, I think the faculty say that students are better prepared and feel better about it, but we don't have data like that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for that, Kendra. I didn't realize you were also on the line, so thanks. Well, I'm going to bring this to a close at this point, but a couple of things. One is I could see this being a good topic for us to consider in a future conversation about the scaffolding, the sort of ratcheting up, as Lumina calls it, how that is in tension with a desire to give students as many choices as possible and put as few obstacles in the way of them as possible, and thus not do sequencing, because I think in some ways that's where that really came from, and where this conversation might take us in light of what's recommended within the DQP. So I do appreciate this and realize we need to go further with it. Any last comments about program review before we go on to our next part of this? Okay, so we will turn it over to Ron, and we're going to talk about mapping.
Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to be very, very brief in making this introduction. Basically, the mapping tool that we have is a very good way to look at whether we are incorporating all of our expected outcomes in our degrees and certificates. But in all the work that's been done to make that a very useful tool, there's still a lot of work that precedes that. And so that's why this session was called Preparing to Map. It's those decisions that have to be made ahead of time on what are the learning outcomes, how much weight do we apply to those before we can actually get to the mapping process to help us get a better visualization, pardon the pun, on what our expectations are for the degrees. So in looking at this particular topic, we reached out to two of our institutions, and colleagues there graciously agreed to share their experiences and their perspectives on this topic of getting to the point of looking at how to map or how to articulate the expectations. Hallie Newport from Oregon Institute of Technology will share her experiences, and then Sarah Ulrich and Christina Howard will follow with the perspectives. They'll do kind of a tag team approach from the Lane perspective. So Hallie, are you online?
I am.
It's all yours. Yes, we can. It's all yours.
I apologize for our technical difficulties earlier. We had a hard time hearing you guys. So I did send to Ron, and I'm assuming he made available just a couple of handouts that might help you follow along with my presentation today. What I essentially did is set out a series of steps that I followed as I mapped our management entrepreneurship program to the DQP. And really the first thing that I thought, or that I looked at, was how to rank or weight those outcomes, our outcomes, in terms of the DQP. I don't think a screenshot of our actual map made it to the group. I'm afraid I might have forgotten to get that out to you. But we have quite a few outcomes in the management department. We have program level outcomes, we have department level outcomes, and then we have institutional outcomes. And so on the handout I did provide, I've listed the bullet items in step one, the program student learning outcomes. I weighted the most heavily. We feel that those program student learning outcomes are essential for our students as they leave OIT with an entrepreneurship or a management entrepreneurship degree. So as I weighted our outcomes to be used in the mapping process, I weighted those most heavily, and then those weights decreased you move down those bullet items there. So the program student learning outcomes I weighted the most heavily, and then we've also made a conscious decision in our department that we will emphasize problem-solving skills, communication skills, and ethical practices across our curriculum. So any outcome, whether it was at the program level, the department level, or at the institutional level, that touched on one of those three skill sets, I weighted those next heavily, second in that line, if you want to think of it that way. And then we have student learning outcomes, which are common to our entire management department. We have a total of 10 programs in the management department, and we are accredited by the International Assembly of Collegiate Business Educators. And that accreditation body has outcomes that they require us to meet in order to be accredited by them. So our student learning outcomes we call our SLOs, and then any of our institutional student learning outcomes that are relevant to management programs, I weighted third heavily in that list of 4, and then our non-business ISLOs as well. So I know that's kind of abstract at this point, but the second handout that I had provided is an actual mapping of the DQP areas. And what I tried to do on that spreadsheet for you is from left to right, essentially, show you our specific program student learning outcomes and the 3 across the curriculum outcomes. I call them the problem solving, the communication, and the ethical practices. And then our SLOs and business related ISLOs, as well as our non-business related ISLOs. So after I had weighted each area of outcome, the program level, the department level, and the institutional level, my next step was really to, for each area of each DQP area of learning, identifying the outcome that associated to that area. So on the spreadsheet, you can see that I've mapped for every area of knowledge there, or area of learning there, I've mapped the outcome that I believe fit most closely, or matched most closely, the DQP area of learning. And once I had completed that process, I looked for frequency of how often the outcomes appeared basically on the spreadsheet. So just very quickly, as a couple of examples, under specialized knowledge, our first student learning outcome, so this outcome is common to the entire management department, we have the outcome of demonstrating an understanding of the functional areas of accounting, marketing, finance, management, and economics. And that fit very well actually with the defines and explains the boundaries and major subfield styles and or practices of the field. But that is the only place in this entire document where that outcome shows up. So when I assigned a weight to that within the mapping, within the DQP mapping, that obviously received 100% for that specific outcome under specialized knowledge. And then as another example, PSLO 9, Program Student Learning Outcome number 9, is not far below that. Demonstrate the ability to manage people, processes, and resources within a diverse organization. I mapped to the idea of demonstrating fluency in the use of tools, technologies, and methods common to the field. And if, again, you were to look through this document, that PSLO actually shows up 4 times. Once under specialized knowledge, now I have to remember where they are, once under intellectual skills, and then twice under applied learning. So when I mapped that to the DQP, I weighted it most heavily in applied learning, since that's where the PSLO showed up multiple times, and then less heavily in the other areas. So very briefly, that's kind of the approach that I took as I looked to map our specific management entrepreneurship program to the DQP. Kind of my reflections on the process as I went through it, and since I've completed the process and thought about it a little bit, is one, it was challenging for me, and I think maybe this was discussed before, but we were unable to really hear what was being said. The language used within the DQP areas of learning seemed very subjective to me. It was very difficult for me to be sure that I was mapping in the right way. And I imagine if you gave this tool to another faculty member within my department, the map at the end would probably look quite a bit different than the map that I came up with. So as an individual exercise, which I know this was just for the sake of of trying the DQP mapping process, it lacked some validity for me. So I don't think that I got as much out of it from that aspect. So it was rather subjective. And then I also found myself having to really drill down to the course level as I was mapping SLOs. On the spreadsheet on the far right, I had a comments column, and as I went through and I had questions, I just kind of jotted down some of the activities that I know take place in a variety of our courses. But in all honesty, I don't know if those are, if that was the intent of the area of knowledge as presented by the DQP. So that was somewhat challenging for me as well. And it did require thinking about specific courses rather than the program as a whole to really try to figure out where these outcomes fit. In all, it was an interesting exercise. We have a very well-established assessment process at Oregon Tech where we do assess institutional, department, and program outcomes on a regular basis. So I don't think it told me anything I didn't already know in terms of the map that I ultimately came up with. So it provided a very nice schematic and I guess reinforced what we are already doing in terms of assessment, but didn't necessarily add any additional value to the process that we currently use. Are there questions? I'd be happy to address questions if there are any.
Hi, this is Tom again at Tillamook Bay Community College. I do notice that you didn't always, particularly for the SLOs, it wasn't unique or distinctive. So, for instance, number 7 comes up in several areas.
Yes.
Did that weight, or how did you determine criteria for which ones cover multiple DQP areas of learning?
Actually, SLO number 7 is our capstone outcome, if you want to think about it that way. This is a required outcome of our accrediting agency, and the intent, I believe, is to take it to kind of that exit level. So it's kind of the outcome that we expect or we would like to see our students demonstrate as they walk out our door. So it did show up on this document probably more than anything else.
Well, obviously there are other ones, though, that you've duplicated multiple times. I mean, I just grabbed that one because it was on the first page. So I didn't know if that affected the weighting in any way in your thinking.
It did. So the more often it showed up on the document, well, especially I should say, more often it showed up within a specific area of learning. So under specialized knowledge, I believe, it shows up twice there. And I would have to go through and see. I don't think, for example, it doesn't look like it shows up at all in intellectual skills, but it's 2 or 3 times in some of these other areas. So the more often it did show up, I rated that more heavily than if it had only showed up once within an area. I'm not sure, is that the question you're asking?
I understood that in terms of multiple times that way, but I'm just thinking if one of them is applied in multiple areas, does that add extra weight, or in a sense, are you thinning the value of that ILO? I don't mean that as negatively as maybe that sounds. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Well, because it's now split, is it now half and half? Or I split that ILO 3 different category areas, and so I now add that as a third fact. You understand?
Yeah, and
or maybe it wasn't as quantitative as that.
Yeah. I didn't get out my calculator and figure out the exact percentages by any means. But no, I understand what you're saying in terms of thinning it out. But I also think it illustrates that capstone ISLO is broad in terms of touching on the various areas of learning. So I'm relatively new to the TQP. This was the first exercise I've actually been asked to participate in when it comes to the DQP. So I would be interested in knowing what the if there's a more appropriate way to take that into consideration, what that would be. Because I do understand the idea, as you say, of the thinning out where it looks like it's a lot of breadth and not much depth.
And I'm not sure I have a specific answer on that either. I don't know, and as I understand it, there is no right way that we are to do it.
Yeah.
There's no prescribed way, I should say.
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
so
Carol?
I guess what I thought about as I started the process is I wanted to emphasize our program student learning outcomes, because I do believe those are most important to our program. So I wanted to make sure that those were weighted a little bit more heavily. But then I also wanted to try and capture across the DQP learning areas, I guess I would call it the breadth. How broad are some of these outcomes in terms of specialized knowledge, broad knowledge, intellectual skills, and so on and so forth? Or are they very focused or concentrated in one area? And that was the approach that I took. I was given a lot of latitude in how to approach this, so I kind of came up with my own ideas as I went through to figure out what might make the most sense for us here at OIT.
What I would add to that is I think, again, it goes back to using this as a tool to stimulate thought and conversation about this, more so than being an end into itself, and allows us to implement our interpretation of what it means, and it means different things to different people, but at least we're starting to think about these a little bit more richly. Again, in the interest of time, let me suspend additional questions for Hallie right now so that we can hear from Sarah and Christina, and then we'll open it up for questions again when they're done. So Sarah and Christina.
Hi there. I'm Sarah Ulrich. I'm Division Dean for Science and an active participant in DQP and the assessment team here at Lane.
I'm Christina Howard. I'm the faculty here at Lane Health Professions and coordinator of the Physical Therapist Assistant Program, Career Technical Program, and the chair of the assessment team here at Lane.
So we have all the virtues of a PowerPoint, but you can't see it. So hopefully you've got it there wherever you are, and we're looking at our paper notes. So what we're going to share with you are some of the strategies and methods that we used for mapping and what we see as strengths and potential challenges. I'm a geologist by training, so I thought I would make a couple of comments on the concept of mapping because it's key to the work of geology and as an analogy might be helpful to us. When you go out to map the surface of the earth and find the rocks that are there, you start with a system of categories of rocks, and it's sort of a hierarchical system where you'd have metamorphics and igneous and sedimentary, and that is the system that has evolved over 200 years of geology. So it's important to remember there's a theoretical construct behind any categories that you choose. And we've talked some about the Bloom's aspect of theoretical construct behind the DQP. But basically, it's a system of categories. And then the work of a geologist is to recognize when they're seeing examples of that particular category of thing. And that's kind of what you're hearing from us and from Hallie about trying to figure out, well, which item in my curriculum looks like this category, and that I'll map to it. Where I think it gets interesting in geologic mapping is you're looking for how extensive is that particular rock type in this area. And that's this challenge we gave ourselves of weighting things, of how much of it is there. If this is an example of applied learning or quantitative fluency, how much of it is in this curriculum or as a course or a program or a degree? So in geology, you can look at how much surface area is covered, but you can also look at how thick is the unit, how deep is that particular type of category, in this case of knowledge. So we'll sort of touch on those aspects as we try to work our way through some examples. I wanted to call back to Carol's comments that we're looking at judgments of word meaning. And so it raises the question of who does the mapping. In geologic mapping, a geologist with some training in the particular type of rock does it. So when we look at the language of the DQP, it makes sense that educators are going to use it, and probably less helpful to employers and advisors who are not trained in the field, which is education in this case. So we want to know who's mapping and whether they're all coming to the same conclusions. So if you go to the second slide, what did we map? Well, we went crazy with it. We had so much fun making these diagrams and using tools and getting our IT guys involved that we mapped in 4 different ways, and we're going to walk you briefly through all of them. We mapped the AOT outcomes to the DQP. Christina mapped her PTA program outcomes to the DQP. Then we mapped the PTA outcomes to Lane's new core learning outcomes, and Joseph Colton on our computer information technology faculty made us a web tool that we could do that. And finally, we mapped Lane's new core learning outcomes to the DQP. So if you take a look at the next fairly detailed chart, and I won't walk you through all of that, but it's sort of a summing up of what we mapped and how we made that determination of categorizing those rocks, if you will, or those rock units, and what we used to weight those outcomes in each of those different aspects of mapping. And then who did it? And you'll notice that basically we sent one lone geologist out in every case with their field fanny pack and a good bottle of water and or possibly other beverages. We're not sure where the mapping actually happened. And they worked alone. So, and I think it sounded like Hallie also worked alone on this. And so it does raise the question of what would you get if you sent a team, and what would they learn in their conversations about is this in fact mapping to that outcome or not mapping, or how many places does this map to, and that sort of thing. And we're happy to answer questions at the end if there's questions about this more detailed slide, but I don't really want to read it to you.
Right.
So
just back on that third slide, if you want to see the AOT map, we have a hyperlink on the slide. Yeah. So when you click on it, it'll take you to the DQP site, and you'll be able to see the map that Mary created for the AOT specifically. And so on the fourth slide, kind of did the reverse of what Hallie did for her program. So similar construct, took the program learning outcomes for the physical therapist assistant program. They're well articulated because we have a national accrediting body, and then looked at them line by line to see where they had shared elements with the DQP. Instead of having the DQP be on the left-hand side of the table and then mapping to student learning outcomes, I did it differently, where I had the program learning outcomes essentially on the left, and then mapped it to language within the DQP. And so you'll see, if you have the slides in front of you, there's a spider web map. It's very heavy on the specialized knowledge, very heavy on the applied learning, not so heavy on the broad integrative knowledge. I did not include the general education courses within the degree just because I didn't have access to that information right away. And very, very small on the civic learning. And that aligns with our program outcomes as well. We have some civic engagement, but not a whole lot. As far as weighting goes, what I did is for a program level learning outcome, if it had crossover amongst the DQP, well, it's a little bit of applied learning and a little bit of specialized and a little bit of engagement. I gave each one equal weights within that. So one learning outcome may have 3 DQP elements. They each weigh a third to equal 1. So that was kind of my weighting process. We mapped it by verbs, so we looked at verbs in our program outcomes and looked at verbs within the DQP and used that to create the map. And then the weights were just by the number of outcomes and then divided to create an average. So that's how that went. Be interesting in the earlier discussion about mapping and transferability. I've got this great map that shows high specialized skills and applied learning. I'm not so certain how that might translate into transferability simply as a representation. So that's kind of something to think about. On the fifth slide, the next thing I did was I looked at Lane's core learning outcomes, which we've recently developed, and I mapped those to the DQP using the same strategy, where our core learning outcomes are on the left, and then looking for shared language within our defining elements against the DQP. So there's a table there on slide 5 which shows an example of Think Critically, which has elements of 3 DQP intellectual skills, analytical inquiry, use of information resources, and quantitative fluency. So although 100% intellectual skills, it was then further subdivided into those sub-elements of intellectual skills. And then create ideas and solutions, you can see there's 3 DQP vertice elements within a single core learning outcome that we have at Lane. So there's an example of a 1-to-1 relationship and then a 1-to-3 relationship when you're looking at Lane against the DQP in a particular core learning outcome. The 6th slide shows the map, and this was a really fun exercise for me and kind of confirmed what we expected in that in our core learning outcomes where we have a heavy emphasis on intellectual skills, and this is represented very well in the map. We kept it at 0 for specialized knowledge simply because the DQP defined those at the time as being major course sequences, and because we don't have major course sequences within our gen ed, we just chose to leave that particular, weighting that particular element out of our process. So those were our 4 mapping activities. With the lone geologist. Yeah. And Mary was a lone geologist.
Right. So some of the strengths that that we've identified, and this is not just conversations between Christina and myself, but we had a mapping summit here at Lane last week where we pulled together all of these projects and shared them with each other and had quite an extensive discussion to help us get this particular presentation ready for you, but also to see what we've been doing and explore some of these conversations. So the strengths that we've identified and listed on the seventh slide are mapping to a framework can help identify gaps in learning outcomes and outcomes assessment. So we were able to see where we're really strong in one area but kind of weak in another. Did we want to do something about that? I think that affected our core learning outcomes development. You want to say something about that?
Yes, so in our core learning outcomes, we identified weaknesses in quantitative fluency and use of information resources. So as we were developing the language for our institutional learning outcomes, we were able to go back while they were still in draft form and reframe some of the outcomes using descriptive language that encapsulated specifically quantitative fluency and use of information resources, and we watched the map then change.
Right. And we also looked at the DQP language for ideas. So we wanted to have an outcome around apply in the core learning outcomes, but we went back to DQP to say, how are they describing that? What are the finer points of that particular outcome? So we also think the maps do create a handy visual reference for learning outcomes assessment, sort of seeing what all are we assessing and how we might move forward. It has the potential to demonstrate horizontal and vertical alignments with shared language. I think we share some of the concerns that have been expressed about the language and being too complex and just sort of overbearing in some ways, and in many cases not really describing what we feel are the learning outcomes at a 2-year level for our students. And we think that if these things were done collaboratively with a team of mapping geologists, there would be that opportunity to discuss the program, discuss core outcomes and course outcomes, see how they all tie together, and really trace that development that we've been talking about toward a capstone experience or toward a more terminal or interim terminal performance level before our students go on to the next thing. Some of the challenges and limitations, we've noted that the DQP verbs are not consistent with the level of learning within programs at Lane, and we suspect that's true for many of our 2-year colleagues out there. The mapping and weighting is complex. It's fairly arbitrary, and the N of 1 has the virtue of restricting the number of arguments that you have, but it's not a best practice for map generation. Geologic mapping works because those maps are then field checked by somebody else, or you're comparing your map to the historical mapping of that area, and you've got a whole body of knowledge in a discipline that's agreed on the defining factors, defining characteristics of those rocks in great detail. we don't have any of that here. We have basically discourse analysis of trying to say, does this sort of sound like that? Would I put this in that category? So we're very cautious about what people make of those maps. They're not grounded in a strong scientific basis at this point. So the quantitative part can be misleading. We had an interesting conversation at our summit about, well, what does it mean if the map lines go further out on the pentagram? Is that a good thing? And it was like, well, no, that's just, we made up some numbers and then it looks like that. So those shapes don't necessarily mean that you are covering more of it. It means within your weighting system, that number got bigger. So are you really mapping the extent in a curriculum? Would someone walk into your class and say, wow, you had a map that showed a lot of intellectual skills, but I'm not seeing that in your curriculum in terms of what you assess or in terms of the time of activities that you do. So we really haven't nailed that down in terms of how does this mapping idea really relate to what goes on in a classroom. And finally, that a balanced web should not be considered a strength nor a goal for a specialized degree like an AAS, that it makes sense that we're going to be weighted in one direction or another. So some questions that we came up with, are the data meaningful? But we had a good conversation about, are we just having fun with tools, because some of us are kind of like to bean count and we like categorizing, and this was fun and you get a picture. So we think there's something to that. What would be the best practices for developing measurement methodologies for qualitative outcomes? What are best practices for setting criteria? So, is it number of credits, number of outcomes, strength of meaning, tied to how much your assessments actually count in your grading scheme? Will this help inform meaningful things like articulation agreements, credit transfers, career pathways, or professional development? And how can students use these tools? Sean, I think at U of O, mentioned earlier a personalized spider web or a major spider web, and it made me think, well, maybe giving the students this construct and say, build your e-portfolio toward this, or look at your own coursework, analyze it yourself, because you're in a position now to say what you learned and how you learned it. Maybe that would be a useful way to use these as well. So those are things we don't think we've written any kind of book on mapping yet, but we had a lot of fun with it. That's us. Are there questions? Discussion?
Well, we've got to take a little bit of time here to ask any questions you might have of Hallie or Sarah or Christina. Anybody like to inquire a little further? Everything complete, nothing more to say.
I wonder if anybody has mapping experiences they'd like to share. Something you've tried to map, or Tom's questions from Tillamook Bay sort of indicated you've had some. You've looked at this some. Is there anybody else out there who's looked at this some and wonders, either has comments or wonders how to go about something?
Well, this is Tom again from Tillamook Bay. I don't want to dominate this, but I will share, and I can't take full credit for this, but because I talked with the math guy. As somebody who's not always comfortable figuring out percentages, 17%, and then figuring out, it was easier for us, particularly at the level when we engaged, particularly at the classroom or course level, but it could be applied as well. Rather than, we were able to reframe it and think of it, just told people to put things on a scale from 1 to 10. And then it changes per line, but by the time then you sum up the total values of all that line and then go back through, we were able to arrive at percentages much easier looking at it on a relative scale. Now, of course, if you have in the 5 domains 10s in all those areas, then it easily breaks out to 25% or 20% in each. But that was a way that we were able to engage faculty a little easier than trying to always think percentages, particularly when you have in a program in some cases, several layers, 15, 20 outcomes or whatever the case. So that would just my 2 cents or contribution, if that helps anybody who else is wrestling with the percentage concept.
Well, and the question that gets raised, of course, is regardless of what algorithm you use to come up with the weights, once it's all said and done, does it give us anything that's useful? Do we have any meaning that comes out of that? We've got something that looks nice and it sounds nice, but so what? And can we affirm the so what from that? And I think that's the next phase of this is dealing with the results and reflecting on the results that we get. Christina, you had a comment?
Well, one thing Marcus talked about earlier was that the next steps being, how do you assess for these? And so when I started looking at mapping more specifically my program to Lane's core learning outcomes, I started looking at, well, how do I assess these particular course level outcomes? How do I do it? Well, I have assignments and discussion activities and things. And those activities are worth certain weights in the course for a grade. So exams are worth 40, papers are worth 20, discussions worth 25. And so I may have an outcome that the student engage in a particular activity, but the weight that I give that is 5% of their grade of the course. And how I determine whether or not students achieve those learning outcomes is up to me as the instructor. My colleague who teaches the same course with the same learning outcomes may have an entirely different grading schema based upon assessments, and yes, the students are achieving the same learning outcomes, but how much are they valued by the instructor, one could argue, could be determined by grading policies within a particular course. So that's when I stopped, because I'm lucky enough for a lot of the courses there is only one instructor. So we're a small program with very limited faculty, but when you're dealing with general education, you've got a writing course or a math course, and some math instructors may give tests, some may do projects, they have different grading systems to achieve those same outcomes. Then your weighting system, what does that mean? How do you reconcile academic freedom in grading and meeting those outcomes, and how much of it you touched on in your course is up to who knows, and could change every term depending on who's teaching the class. And so I'll be interested to see when they look at methods of assessment as their next phase with the DQP project, how they're going to incorporate how different individual instructors within the same course learning outcomes apply different weights to how they assess students meeting those outcomes. Because I know that students look at the grading criteria, and that's how they discover what the instructor values. If the instructor puts 70% of my grade on a multiple choice exam, then my outcome better be that I can identify these things, because 70% of my grade is based on whether or not I learn how to identify things or differentiate things, as you would on a multiple choice exam. But if I'm supposed to synthesize and analyze and exposit on something, I should be expecting to write a lot of papers. Is that in fact happening in this class? It's going to be an interesting challenge to see how that will be assessed on such a broad level across institutions.
Well, the more we get into this, the more I'm convinced that this is, as the old saying goes, like nailing jelly to a tree. It's kind of, it looks good for a second. You have that moment of understanding which quickly vaporizes and it starts dribbling down there. Or maybe it's, to quote the great Gilda Radner as Rosanna Dana, it's always something. The more we learn, the more it's, oh yeah, well now there's something else we have to think about as well. So to wrap this up, again, I want to thank Hallie and Sarah and Christina for some excellent presentations and some stimulating thought. And we'll wrap this up with... Yeah.
So the last thing we have today is a look at next year. And one of the documents on the website is Oregon DQP Next Steps. And I would encourage you to open that up and look at it. And I'm going to try and just kind of quickly summarize that document a little bit. It gives you a bit of a description of what is in the grant, the Lumina grant proposal that we sent in, related to institutional engagement, which is the piece we're really focused on this first year, but also related to horizontal alignment and vertical integration, which will start becoming our areas of focus next year. And we've tried to give you a bit of information about the objectives of the grant, and also a short synopsis of our progress so far so that you've got some information for each of those three areas or initiatives, if you will, kind of what's expected and also where we are now. So a couple of things I'll just say in trying to summarize this document. One is, when we wrote the proposal, we wrote things that if we were to look at it today, we would not write them. We won't achieve all of it. And one of the great things about this grant is that Lumina is more interested in what we learn than what we achieve. So if we don't get maps from almost every institution and almost every degree, which is what's in the proposal, if that isn't accomplished, what matters is what we learn from that. Why aren't we doing those maps? When are they meaningful? When aren't they meaningful? What do we learn from doing them? What do we learn from not doing them? So we'll really be focusing on the learning from that, not necessarily the exact result that's listed in the proposal. And that's true for all three sections. So that's one thing I want to be sure you go away with. The other thing I want to be sure you understand is what's going to be expected and happen in the fall. We heard from feedback that you gave us in your progress reports from several different schools that they thought that when it comes to horizontal alignment and vertical engagement, that the kind of organic way we've gone about it this year with institutional engagement, find in your institution where this will best connect, and you go ahead and use the DQP in that environment, and let's see what we can use. We really tried to leave it very much up to you as to where you engaged with it. In terms of horizontal and vertical alignment, we are going to try and be a bit more, because it's collaborative, we're going to put a bit more of structure around it with the hope that that helps you, not stands in your way. So in terms of horizontal alignment, we will be, community colleges will be having a discussion over the summer. I'll be involved in that discussion. OUS schools will be in a discussion over the summer. Ron will be involved in that discussion. We're going to try to identify degrees that, that you think will benefit from horizontal alignment discussions. And I know some discussions have already taken place amongst those two groups. We'll be actually trying to identify them and develop a work plan around how to move forward with it. We're also looking for some pilot projects for vertical integration discussions. Some of you in your first year work plans had information in there or ideas in there about vertical integration. We're going to check in with you, see whether you think that's still viable. Vertical integration by its very nature needs to have both community college and OUS involved, at least one institution from each, could be more. We'll try and create some sort of alliances around this work. You know, maybe 3 to 5 projects is what we're thinking, but we'll see what naturally evolves from those discussions. So for next year, some of you will be continuing your institutional engagement work because you haven't completed yet, which is fine. It's a 3-year grant. But you will be asked to update your work plans on institutional engagement for what you're doing. Get those updated by October 15th and get those plans started. Over the summer, we'll be identifying horizontal and vertical alignment kind of projects, and those two things will be discussed more fully at a fall conference. We don't have a date yet, but we'll get that to you as soon as we do. And those work plans will be due November 15th. The work plan on the website is the work plan you will continue to work with and update. It has a year 1 section, a year 2 section, a year 3 section. It has institutional engagement, a horizontal alignment, a vertical integration section. So you will be entering information based on what parts you're involved in. If you're done with institutional engagement, that won't be on your work plan next year. You might be part of the horizontal discussion, you might be part of a vertical discussion. So those things would be filled in. So your work plans will shift for the second year depending on where you're engaging. We're not expecting every institution to be involved in every piece. It's what's going to make the most difference to you. So you'll be hearing from us as the horizontal discussion evolves and as the vertical alliances emerge. Whether you want to participate in those or not will be up to you. I think it's interesting when you hear Lumina and others, especially the DQP writers, talk about the projects that Lumina has funded. They're watching Oregon carefully. They expect to learn a lot from us because we are the only place that they've funded that's really looking at this as a state. The others are looking at various specific aspects of it. We're going about something they hope other states will do. So they really want to learn from what our experiences are. And that means we have to document what we learn. So as I was listening to some of the things Lane was talking about learning from mapping, those are the kinds of things they want to hear. Because if mapping is really useful to this, they may develop something that really encourages that across the country. If we find it not that useful, then they don't want to go down that road. So they really are looking to learn from our experiences. They want to know our reflections on what's working, what's not working, what questions are emerging, what challenges are emerging. Those are the things they want to hear, and we will continue to work at keeping you focused on that over time. So you'll still get questions from us asking you to comment on different things throughout the year. Your second year progress report will be due in March, just like your first year progress report was due in March. So March 2014, it will have a similar look and structure and a similar set of questions in it that you'll just be updating and such. So a lot of the structure for reporting and tracking work will be very similar to what has occurred this year. We'll just be using the same tools next year. So that's a very quick nutshell that hopefully the document has a little bit more detail. And again, OUS schools will be meeting with Ron, and I'll be meeting with community colleges to talk more fully about this. Within that document, there are 4 questions. If you are having a team meeting after this today, and we're trying to wrap up so you can do that if you choose to, those 4 questions may be very useful to you. It talks about what is it you need to be doing in order to progress with your institutional engagement work next year. Get some ideas down on paper about what will be useful. Gets you starting to think about particular areas, degrees where you might want to have a vertical conversation with OUS or community college, where you might think that a discussion around horizontal alignment related to student learning outcomes would be useful across community colleges or across universities. So I encourage you to look at those questions and use them with your team as starting points. I'll stop for a minute to give you a chance to ask any questions you might have about that as we wrap up. Any questions about that document and what I've just talked about? Yes.
So as far as horizontal alignment, horizontal work, will that be something in the summer that we'll make a decision as to who is going to collaborate with whom and do it then? Or do we come to the summer project with these are my ideas and these are the people I'd like to collaborate with?
So I think the summer conversation will, for horizontal, probably identify some specific areas to go. So I'll speak of it from the community college side because that's what I know, okay? So some things that have emerged as ideas, AAOT as a conversation is one possibility. Some of the statewide degrees have emerged as ideas because they're supposed to have alignment across learning outcomes, and some of them haven't been revisited in quite some time, and that could be useful. So manufacturing might be one. The paraeducators have talked about being interested. We may not just zero in on one thing, there may be a couple of them, but it will be a way to look at learning outcomes across institutions. So that's kind of the idea.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
This is Carol Harding from Western. One question I had, instead of potentially duplicating some work that's already been done, like I know OEAC has had talks over the years about aligning writing 115, writing 121, and so forth.
Yes.
Has there been talk about just kind of collecting the information from some of these groups to insert into that?
There has been talk about that. We need to be careful not to forget it. So I appreciate you bringing it up. And I will say with both horizontal and vertical, we are looking still at trying to build on work that's already there.
Right.
So those kinds of things, I know writing has emerged as a discussion point, in particular, I think, from the OUS assessment group. But trying to build on work that's already there is certainly part of it. What I'm hoping will happen is there'll be some conversations at institutions about what are some likely good ideas, and those ideas will be brought to the conversations during the summer. And for the community colleges, I think the conversation will happen amongst the CIA folks, so the chief academic officers. I think will be the ones who will be sort of figuring out where should horizontal alignment take place. Vertical alignment can be smaller groups, so it can be one, OSU and Lynn Benton have talked about a vertical alignment project, for example. As long as you have one community college, one OUS school, you've got enough, but you can have more than that also. There's some other ideas that have evolved, some of it building off of the Witchy project and what's been done there already and such. So,
Carol, can I say that? So OEAC wrote outcomes. We revised outcomes a number of years ago. We probably need to revise them again. But the issue with writing outcomes is they don't mean a lot unless we have conversations that actually look at student written work. And we haven't ever had the money to do that. And so again, it comes down to, if we want to have meaningful conversations about horizontal alignment, there has to be money that brings together faculty from across institutions to talk about the meaning of those outcomes.
Great, thank you for that. And we will be, as this year we had small amounts of money to disperse to institutions. We are working on what that amount will be for next year. We recognize that horizontal and vertical work takes a different kind of collaboration than we've had on institutional work. And we're trying to work with the core team for the DQP to determine how we can disperse money that encourages that kind of work. So hopefully, I know we don't have enough to pay for all of it, but hopefully we have enough to incentivize a little bit of it.
And Susquehanna's going to be the chair of OEAC in a year.
Great.
So
good. Okay.
So we have that.
We got a ringer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm cognizant that we're running out of time here, and have run out of time actually, and some of you probably have other things to get to. I want to thank you very much for being on the video and on the telephone today. If you have lingering questions, you can certainly contact Ron and I, and our email addresses are at the end of the Oregon DQP Next Steps document, if you don't have them some other way. So thank you very much, really appreciate it. Thank you very much to the presenters and the preparation you did for today. Sign it off.